Welcome to this video on doing Kali installs, using the install media as though you were installing on a bare bones machine. This is typically much longer than the alternative method, but has historically been the de facto. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to navigate to the Kali website, which is kali.org. So in a browser, type that URL and go to that web page. So from here we'll click the download button and that'll take us to the various options that we'll have with respect to the format style of the installer. So we'll choose the bare metal option for this installer, and that'll take us down to architecture type that we want to choose. We want to choose the 64-bit and we want to select the installer. But note how I'm hovering over the download arrow. The options are the download, the torrent, or the checksum for the file. So we'll select the download arrow and we'll download the ISO installer to our local hard drive. With the file downloaded, we can now launch VirtualBox or your Type 2 virtualization application of choice. And we'll click the new button to create a new virtual machine. So it'll open a pop-up dialog box and we'll label our virtual machine and we'll give it a meaningful name. So in this instance, I'm calling it Kali Install Media so that we'll know the difference between the two. Choose an appropriate place to store your virtual machine files, because they will be quite large or potentially quite large, and I choose them in a spare disk that I have a lot of space in. For the type, we're going to choose Linux, and for the specific type of Linux, we're going to choose Debian, as Kali is a Debian derivative. Once you've done that, click Next, and you'll be taken to your RAM configuration page. So we'll choose a certain amount of RAM to give the machine. I'm going to choose approximately 2 gig, and at this point we want to create a new virtual disk and not use an existing one. And at this point we will choose VDI, which is the de facto standard for VirtualBox. For the storage type of the virtual hard disk, we're going to choose dynamically allocated. This means that the file is going to be using sparse files, so that it'll only consume the amount of space it actually physically consumes and nothing more, even though we may have over allocated that space. We'll set on the size of 20 gig and click OK, and now we've got a created brand new virtual machine. This just gives us our bog standard virtual machine. It doesn't give us anything else. So at this point we need to attach the install media to the virtual DVD drive. So you can see I've gone into settings and now I've selected the empty DVD drive that is part of the install, and I'm going to go and choose a file that is going to represent our virtual disk drive. So you can see I've chosen choose file, and that takes me off to the file explorer, and I can choose the file and it's selected and attached as part of the virtual machine, and I'll click OK. At this point we're all set and configured. We just need to click start and it'll launch, and it should boot from the DVD drive. So on the drop down list we'll select our new ISO file that we've attached to activate it and attach it properly, and you can see we've booted into the actual installer, and we've got an option whether we can choose graphic installer or a text-based installer. For this install I've chosen to use the graphical installer, and you'll see the screen's gone blank for a bit as it's beginning its boot process. It'll post and then eventually boot to DVD. At this point you may see a few errors or invalid arguments, but these are safe to ignore. And we've successfully booted into our install wizard. So we'll select English as our install language of choice, and we'll choose our region, and our region for this install should be Australia, which is our location. So we select Australia, we select continue. The keyboard choice will keep as American English, which is the standard. Most keyboards are American English. Select continue, and it'll go away and do some initial hardware detection and continue on with the install. You can see now that the hardware detection is completed, so we'll configure the network by telling it what the host name we want it called as, and for this install I'm just going to keep the host name as Kali. You can specify a domain name if you're part of a domain, but on this install I'm going to keep it as the default blank. Now for this part we need to specify a user, which is a non-privileged user whom we're going to log in as, because it's poor practice to log in as the root user. On this install I'll choose Kali, which is the default, and as their username we'll also keep it as Kali. Now we'll input the password for this user, and I'll stick with the defaults, which is Kali, and you can see I've typed in Kali in the password fields. And we're going to configure where we are in terms of time zones and clocks. Now this is where you're probably best to leave everything as a default. We'll use the entire disk, which is the wizard's best guess and usually works in most instances. We'll select the disk that we created in our initial steps, which was the 20 gig hard drive, and we're going to use all files in one partition, unless you understand what you're doing, just to stay with the defaults. So this is our summary. This is what we're going to do. This is what the installers suggested that we need. So it's going to give us one partition and another partition for our swap drive. It's going to ask us if we really want to do this, because at this point it will actually write those partitions to disk and it's no longer undoable. It'll go off now and install the base system, which is just the default Linux binaries, and then after this it'll install the necessary applications that you select appropriate for your install. The initial install is completed, and this is where we get to choose which specific applications we want to install. Again, I'm going to stick with the defaults. Unless you know what you're doing, you can dig into it, but for this video I'll stay with the defaults. And the installer will go away and install those specific applications, as well as the desktop that you chose. So the software packages have completed installing, and now at this point we are asked by the wizard where we want to install the bootloader. The bootloader in this instance is Grub, which is a Grand Unified bootloader, and we're going to install it on our specific hard drive. You get this option just in case you might have multiple operating systems and you're using some other operating system bootloader. Again, unless you know what you're doing, stay with the defaults. So now it's going to install the bootloader so we can successfully boot into Linux. So the bootloader is finished installing, and the wizard's automatically rebooted the machine for us. So now we're actually booting into our installed Linux environment. So you can see that this is the initial boot screen, and we're actually completely booting into our Linux install. The initial splash screen for Kali, and we should very shortly have a login screen where we can log in as Kali. And here's our login screen, and we'll log in as the default Kali. And we're in. This is our desktop. If you followed along and you've gotten this far, congratulations. We've successfully managed to install Linux from scratch as though we were installing on a bare bones machine.